now the creator economy with our friends at Patreon, Ronnie Krieger, General Manager Europe, and Noura Labani, Creator Partnerships, France and Belgium. Guys, I'm so happy to have you with us. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much for the invite. We're glad to be here. My name is Ronnie Krieger. As was mentioned, I am part of the music industry for the past 30 years. I've worked with distributors, a download shop, where I also worked with Noura for several years. I've worked with record labels and pretty much done everything there is as part of the music industry for the first half of my career in the physical world, and then been part of the digital journey as well, and have joined Patreon in the later half of 2019 to help establish the European operations here in Berlin. And Noura has joined the team.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Noura. My background is also in music. I've been working in the music scene in Berlin for over 15 years. Started at record labels like K7 Records, worked at companies like EMI Music, Daily Motion, together with Ronnie at Beatport, and we reunited at Patreon when I joined last year in September as a creative partnerships manager for France and Belgium.
Yeah, and essentially what we're trying to do here is not so different to what we had done at Beatport at the time, is essentially make Patreon a more domestic experience across the globe, and no longer just a US English only, US dollar only platform, but instead make it look and feel like a domestic platform in all regions in the world. And we're starting that with Europe, and hired a lot of qualified, experienced talent from multiple different creative verticals. And Noura obviously brought a lot of her experience to the table as well, and is now helping us spread the word of Patreon in the territories of France and Belgium, and do so in the native language, which is obviously quite more pleasant for creators than having to deal with US dollars and English all the time. So essentially, let's start maybe with what is Patreon, because some of you may have not heard about the company yet. Patreon is a membership platform that focuses on two elements. One, we want to make sure that creators are being paid fairly, that they have a recurring, substantial way to monetize their work, and no longer depend on micro fractions of payments that not really feel worth their time and are not helping them to survive. And the other element is really to find ways to closer engage with their communities and fan base, and people that really ultimately care about what they do. And the unique thing about Patreon is that it's actually founded by a musician who was struggling with the digital landscape that he was surrounded with. He was a musician who was very active on YouTube, and he had reached quite a substantial audience. He was able to sell out shows, and all of the videos that he uploaded to YouTube had 1 million plays, so he was quite successful. And then he had this ambitious idea of wanting to do a crazy video with a robot, and maxed out all of his credit cards, spent over 10K on the production of it, took him forever. As usual, he crossed the 1 million benchmark of views. He was very happy about it until he received the paycheck of the ad revenue shared with him, which was something along the lines of $160. And then he started to get really, really frustrated, being like, this is broken. This is not working. How can I have such a gigantic audience, so many loyal fans who appreciate what I do, and then be able to make $160 a month from that? That there must be a better way. And so he got in touch with a student friend of his from university, Sam, and the two of them discussed the idea of, what if we create a business that doesn't put the interest of a platform first and doesn't look at it as a business, but actually thinks of a sustainable model for an artist of any sort. And that's how they came up with the idea of Patreon, and then relatively quickly made it work as a pretty simple startup idea. And what I love about it is that when they launched Patreon, actually payment wasn't working yet. And since Patreon is a monthly subscription service, they had exactly 30 days to build the payment function of Patreon, because otherwise, for the first time of the billing, there would be no one able to pay the bill. And that's an approach that kind of like continued in the build of Patreon and is quite unique. Another thing that probably a lot of startups wouldn't have done, originally when Jack had the idea of Patreon, he made a long list of US creators who he felt would probably love the idea of Patreon and could be really successful, was a similar model, had a similar situation like his, was a built audience and being quite engaged. And literally none of the people that he reached out to said yes. Everybody said no. And I don't know very many founders who would do such research, hear no from everyone they approach, and then still continue and build that business. But Jack was so convinced that it's the right idea that he continued to do so. And quickly it became a success for him. And so he basically had the proof of concept. And then, not unusual to the trajectory of the music industry, even though built by a musician for a music use case, in his case, the creative verticals that adopted Patreon first were everything else but music. It was mostly video content creators, podcasters, visual artists, all kinds of other creators. And musicians actually came to the table relatively late, which is also my experience in the digital realm of music, unfortunately, that we usually wait a little bit too long. And once everyone else has already adapted new businesses, we come to the table. Patreon has now run through multiple rounds of funding, and we are in a very stable financial position where we've raised well over 400 million and are essentially able to use the money that we raised with the last two funding rounds completely to look into the future and help us grow our business and build out the platform to be even more successful in the future. And now I'd love to hand over to Noura to tell you a little bit more about who is Patreon for and what can you do on the platform.
Yeah, so first of all, maybe why Patreon? Ronnie mentioned a few points, but let's talk about it a little bit more in detail. So why do artists and creators decide to work with Patreon? So first of all, it gives them creative control, freedom, and independence. We exist to help creators build independent creative careers and businesses so that they have more freedom in their work and get closer to the people who love their work. Patreon gives artists freedom to explore all areas of their creativity, meaning that musicians don't need to just share music on Patreon, but basically they can show their entire creative universe. We will talk about some examples later, but Patreon gives artists and creators a place to open up, to be more personal, and also like test new things that they wouldn't want to announce to a wider audience right away, and all that in a safe environment, away from negativity, trolls, and algorithm. Then it's all about the direct relationship and fan data. So in the sea of fans, Patreon helps creators identify the most engaged ones. And we help creators truly own that audience. That means that 100% of the posts the creator will make on Patreon will be delivered to 100% of their members. And the creator gets access to their names, their emails, their addresses, so they really know who their fans are, and they have a way to directly communicate with them. I'm going to quote Gary Newman, who's also on Patreon, and he said that social media is great. It can offer things that are valuable and informative, but it's like having a beautiful garden with no fence. Anyone can just wander in, start trouble, cause damage, and then leave. I want to build something that is more exclusive, where only real fans come in, and where you get something you can't get anywhere else. I think that's pretty well put. And then maybe last but not least, it's about generating a predictable and consistent income. Financial freedom is creative freedom. And with Patreon, creators generate a recurring revenue source from the people that they can rely on, which is their fans. And artists have super fans, not just the average fans, but those who can't get enough. Given the chance, these super fans are willing to pay for bonus content, such as behind the scenes, early access, exclusive merch, or even just the feeling to be part of this artist's world and support. And in return, the artist gets a sustainable revenue stream and a direct line of communication with the biggest fans. So what sort of creators should join Patreon, and who is the ideal Patreon creator? The ideal Patreon creator enjoys interacting with fans. wants and feels comfortable with that closer fan connection. As an example, we have, for example, Bat for Lashes. So Natasha joined Patreon to create a place for her and her fans to be part of a creative community and gain inspiration, a safe haven away from the busy world of social media. And since she launched her Patreon page a couple of months ago, she has repeatedly mentioned how heartwarming the comments and the feedback of the Patreon community has been for her. Some of the benefits that she offers are, for example, handwritten letters, exclusive personally designed mood boards, recipes, and even tarot readings. Another great example is the Berlin-based electronic musician Emika. She says about herself that the music industry just doesn't work for people like her. She's highly creative and independent. She's working across different genres. And Patreon for her is really about connecting to people through her music. And she says that it really helped her to bring deeper meaning into why she's doing it, and maybe more importantly, also for who she's doing it. She shares also on her social media account that she has been making some really great connections and even new friendships through her Patreon, and she loves the opportunity that she has to connect with her fans. Emika, I think at the moment offers six different tiers on Patreon, offering music behind the scenes, but also a mentoring program which consists in like one-on-one guidance via phone calls. So what else should the ideal Patreon creator have? An engaged fan base. Engagement is actually more important than just pure numbers. The way Patreon generally works is that between 1 and 10% of the followers and fans will sign up to become members. And the more engaged the fan base, the higher this conversion rate is likely to be. There's, for example, Martin. He's a Dutch DJ living in Washington. As a DJ, producer, and operator of a label, Martin has been creating house and techno music for over 15 years. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when 17 of his gigs got canceled within a week, he chose to see this as an opportunity. He decided to build a mentoring program on Patreon because he noticed that there were hardly any resources available for artists in need of a mentor. So he offers monthly Q&A sessions with industry experts, workshops on topics ranging from production, music, business to artistry, and even taking care of your mental health, as well as a one-to-one membership sessions for top-tier patrons. Martin has an engaged fan base, but more importantly, he created also a concept and an offering on Patreon that is extremely well targeted for his audience and that speaks to them, resulting in a high conversion of followers into members. And perhaps the most important point, the ideal creator has to want to be on Patreon. Their enthusiasm will be the key in delivering consistent benefits and promoting their page. So I worked personally on a launch in May of 5 French feminist activists. So basically, after being censored on Instagram, they decided to launch their Patreon pages in May. And they decided to move their activities to Patreon, which they feel is a freer and safer space to express themselves. They have all highly engaged fan bases. However, due to the random censoring and shadow banning of their accounts, their visibility on Instagram was basically non-existent. And it was really hard for them to create a feeling of community and stay engaged. They say that they wasted way too much energy and time to constantly battle to try to trick the algorithm of Instagram instead of being able to focus on content and creation and building a community. So they prefer to spend the energy productively, and they have been extremely creative on the ways they're using Patreon as a group. From our first conversation, you could feel excitement and enthusiasm from their side, coming up with great ideas and concepts on how to start building the communities on Patreon. And it has been really inspiring also for me to see how they have been supporting each other during the process by synchronizing their benefits, helping to promote each other's pages, and also organizing events together. At the moment digitally, but I actually just saw that they're shifting to physical meetups, which is super exciting, and they're trying to organize, for example, a group excursion to an art exhibition in Paris right now. And one last example, maybe because it's one of my favorites, is the band Efterklang. And again, it's about wanting to be on Patreon. So I can only recommend to check their Patreon intro video. They have apparently a passion for socks, and they have created the Socks Society on Patreon, offering socks as benefits. The socks are inspired by the artwork of the band, and it's a great story. It's engaging. It's creating an emotional link with their fans. And they also include their fans in their creative process, for example, asking them to be beta testers for the new songs. So really, they tick all the boxes for me of the ideal Patreon creator because they enjoy interacting with their fans. They have a super engaged fan base, and they really have fun being on Patreon. Over to Ron.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm glad you included the Afterklang, because the Sock Society is one of the most unique elements of any one of the creators on Patreon. And it's actually quite interesting to often see creators who come or have been associated with one particular vertical in the past. And then on Patreon, all of a sudden you discover new creative sites that you didn't know about, because again, they're not pigeonholed to just one form of creativity. They can literally create the creative universe that they would like to share with their audience. And since it is not public, they're also a lot more likely to experiment and try out new things. And that's quite heartwarming and interesting to see. And for me, as someone being for, as I said, a couple of decades in the music industry, a couple of particular elements that stand out in the current creative economy are possibilities that we never had. Nora was mentioning the recurring stable income. If you've been a creator until recently, you never had a stable recurring income. You always had to deal with the periods of, luckily, if you're successful, lots of cash at one point, and then long periods of no cash at other points. And you kind of always had to balance that. And some people do that better than others. And some people may not or never get the big influx of cash. And so Patreon or membership in general is a really great way to have a reliable income every single month that you can count on. And from our experience, the churn rate for these kind of membership subscription is relatively low. So it's quite predictable. And not only that it gives you a certain stability and allows you to create in peace and freedom, in the past, you've also always been reliant on a finished product. I remember when I started in the industry in the 90s, there would be people who would work for an entire year or 2 years on a product and would spend a hell lot of time and resources on creating a book or a movie or an album or something along those lines. And then you would have a year or two and tour the world and promote the album and sell the album. And then you would find a licensing partner in one territory. And the whole monetization cycle may have been equally long as the procedure of creating the record. And then the more and more we shifted towards the digital realm, the creation process didn't necessarily get much shorter, but the monetization cycle. And I still remember when downloads became the main format, particularly in the industry that I was active at the time and Nura was, you essentially had a time window of a couple of weeks where 90% of your sales were generated within 2 to 8 weeks potentially. And then afterwards, your track sales would drop dramatically unless you had an instant hit. And so you went from a quite long monetization period to a rather short monetization period. And if you're now looking at the streaming world, these monetization periods have even shortened. And very often, if the algorithm doesn't pick up a certain momentum of your track or your release in the first week, the doors are kind of closed and pretty much everyone moves on to the next releases the next week. And so the creative process is still very long, but the monetization window gets shorter and shorter. And most of the digital platforms that have launched in the last couple of years have always told you that they're there for exposure, but they're not necessarily for you to make money, because with that exposure, you'll then be able to make money elsewhere. And there were more and more places that were selling you exposure, but less and less places that were actually generating money. That's why I believe the idea of membership is really, really powerful, because you only need a small group of dedicated fans who are willing to pay you every single month to have a recurring revenue and to be able to create. And the range on Patreon is quite large. It can be, depending on your goal, depending on your status as a creator, it can start from a couple of €100 a month that help you to contribute to your costs, or it can go up to almost $1 million a month for really successful creators. And that range is gigantic. And I'm sure we've only scratched the surface of membership so far. And in a couple of years from now, we'll see creators make substantially more money. If we see the trajectory of Patreon, it took years to pay out the first 500 million to creators. Then it took only 14 months to do the same amount again. Then in 2020, we paid out $1 billion to creators. And now we're on a trajectory to pay out more than $1 billion every single year and growing still really, really fast. And I would still consider membership to be only at the early stages. So a lot of promising moments still to come. In regards to Patreon, we have also publicly announced that Patreon is now working on discovery elements. If you go to Patreon right now, the homepage doesn't really do much to help you find any creators. And the business has always been built around the way of artists directing their communities directly to their page. But we're now, during the next months and years, we're building out more and more of the discovery element platforms as well, so that not only creators with an existing fan base, but also creators that want to build a fan base can start there on Patreon. So a lot of exciting product features to come in the next months and years. And also similar to what we described with Nora and other hires that we've started here in the team in Europe, we're trying to roll out Patreon in even more languages. And while we launched 5 languages last year, we're going to launch well over 20 this year, a ton of currencies, a ton of payment methods to really make the experience more domestic and more natural to a lot of creators and their supporters in the world. And last but not least, Patreon is pretty low key if you want it to be. You don't really need to invest a lot of time. I believe a lot of creators feel that in order to be on Patreon, I need to have a lot of resources. I need to have a lot of time and a lot of commitment. But if planned well, and if you have an idea, and as Nora mentioned multiple times, if you really want that engagement with fans, it doesn't have to start with a huge commitment. It could be, you know, an hour or 2 hours, 3 hours a month if you want to start that way, as long as the anticipation is clear and you mention that clearly to your fan base. It is still a valuable experience and can be a good start. So it's relatively little effort. It's not exclusive. So Patreon doesn't take the stance to say, leave everything else and just focus on membership. That's not what we're suggesting. We see membership as one piece of the puzzle that's really rewarding creatively in terms of user engagement, and especially might be the most rewarding in terms of monetization. But it's not exclusive. It's by nature for the fans that really care about everything that you do, that want to support you monthly. But a majority of the people that maybe just want to listen to one of your tracks or want to buy one of your t-shirts or whatever, they're not necessarily going to subscribe to you every single month. So by nature, Patreon is for one part of your audience, and it plays really well with all the other elements and components of your creative landscape and ecosystem, but can largely contribute on the financial side, much more so than most of the other models there. So I really encourage all the creators out there to look into membership and not have this preconception of, hey, I don't have the time for it, or it would be too much work for me to do this. It really isn't. And also think about it very creatively and very unique, because you're not, as we said before, boxed into one specific thing that you are known for. Maybe you are a musician and you always had this idea of a docu-series, or you're painting, or you do something else. In a membership context, you can share all of that with your audience. And you're also free of budgets, because you're not monetizing the finished product, you're monetizing your creative existence, your creative process. So technically speaking, if you want to work for 10 years on your next book or on your next album, as long as the creative journey is interesting enough for your followers, you can do that. And you can take all the time and all the money to create the dream project, no matter how long it takes. And that's also quite unique, because in the past, you usually had an advance, or you had a certain budget to go into the studio, to write a certain album, to do a certain movie. And now you have the creative freedom to do it with the support of your community and take all the time in the world to do that in a way that it's entertaining, that it's fun. You can test it interactively if you like to, and you never have to worry about anything of that to be public, because the audience that follows you there likes what you do. They're committed to support you, and that's really, really interesting, I think, as a creative journey. The last thing I would like to say is that a lot of creative people struggle with the idea of putting a price tag to their work. And traditionally, they never had to, because if you put out an album before, you didn't have to choose how expensive your album would be. That's what your record label would do, or your distributor, or even the store. Now we see that, especially with membership, when you have to decide how much you want to charge for something, people struggle with that. And they also have the conception that they don't like to ask for money. But we see from our experience that there's a lot more people willing to support them and pay them much more than they think. So if anyone out there thinks about membership and is struggling with the idea to put a price tag to it, we have multiple ways to get in touch with Patreon. We host multiple events in digital and physical form. So please get in touch with us, discuss your ideas, and I'm sure we'll find a way how we can put that into the Patreon context. Or, you know, if you just want to learn about membership in general, regardless of Patreon, we're also open to have that conversation. So please reach out in case you have any questions. Nora, do you have anything you would like to add?
No, just basically, you know, working with creators on a day-to-day basis. It's been extremely inspiring to see all the different possibilities that creators are using Patreon. And I think that's also the interesting part. There's not one formula that's going to work for every creator in the same way, but it's a very individual concept. Of course, there's like best practices, and we're there to suggest them to you and help you through the launch process. But I think what is interesting is that you have so much freedom and to be creative. And you need to think, when you think about membership, you need to think about, first of all, your audience, like who's my audience. You need to you know, think about benefits and also the pricing that fits to your particular audience. And then also, what do I want to do as a creator? So in general, when I start a conversation with a creator, the first question I ask is, what would you like to do? You know, what is something that you always wanted to do that you couldn't do so far? Is there like a specific project? Is there something you always wanted to share with your community that you couldn't? And that's how we start the conversation and build basically the concept around that. And I find the work super interesting, because really so far, more or less every launch that I had and every work with creator or artist has been extremely individual. And so it keeps it interesting. And it's also interesting that even though you think you have seen it all, then somebody comes up with an amazing idea, and we try to make it work in the frame of membership, basically. So yeah, I'm looking forward to even more creativity and even more artists starting to see the benefits of membership.
Thank you. That's a wonderful final word. So I believe we can.
Hey guys, thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I'm a huge fan of what you are building since years. So thank you for your time. I've checked the chat, and I think there's no specific question you haven't already answered, because it was really clear. Thank you very much. Just to know, Ronnie, where are you based? In Berlin, correct?
We deliberately took the approach of having one central European office. Patreon is, I didn't go into the financial details, etc., but we were extremely low margin. We are taking 5 or 8% for membership, compared to 20 to 50, which is the general share in that regard. And the easiest way to waste money is to open up offices in all the territories that you operate in. And so from the start, we wanted to be cautious and wanted to pay out as much money as we can to creators instead of spending it on things like offices. And Berlin really, for multiple reasons, felt like a great place to do that. And when I started in the music industry, actually the most east territory that was considered a market was Germany, and then everything afterwards was not really a market, and that obviously has changed now. So also geographically, Berlin really is in the middle of EMEA. So for a lot of reasons, it made a lot of sense to have one central office there and have all of the creative facing, all the creative partnerships, all the marketing teams for the EMEA region located in Berlin. And even if you travel frequently to all the countries, it's an hour or two, and it's still way cheaper than having offices in every market. So that was the reason and logic behind it.
So next year we'll have you here in Belgium. It's not so far from Berlin for the next conference, I hope, physically. Because, you know, after a talk like this, it's always good to continue the discussion with a beer. So I hope to have you guys next year in Liège. to continue the discussion. I hope to see you before that, obviously. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being with us. Have a good night. So to close the session, it was the second day of California. We had more than 30 speakers today, 3 keynotes and 5 panels. We talked about fans and content. It was a very insightful day. Tomorrow, it's the third day of the summit. We'll talk about data, insights, and analytics. Let's meet at 11 a.m. CSST for the first conference. Thank you to all the speakers, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye, guys.